24 hours of Shabbat. So the question the Rebbe asks in the Sichot Chelik Chet, page 50. The 24 hours of Shabbat, are they considered one entity, which is composed of 24 hours, and it resembles like a body. Just like a body, it consists and is composed of different parts. Nevertheless, it creates, or it composes one whole body. And only when all these different limbs come together, this is what we have something called a full body, a guf shalem. And therefore that means that they're one entity as a body, and not two, and not separate limbs. Or should we say שבכל רגע ורבע מהשבת הוא גוף נפרד ויחידה עצמית שאינה תלויה באחרים? Or should we say that every moment of Shabbat is not one simple entity of 24 or 25 hours, that is one simple metziut of 24 hours or 25 hours, one full day? Or should we rather say, no, every moment of Shabbat is a separate entity to itself, and it's not like a body that composes one single entity? Now, what's the nafka kamina? What do we derive out of this halachically? So there's a difference between these two approaches based on somebody that was mechalel Shabbat, somebody that desecrated the holy day of Shabbat. Do we say if the whole day of Shabbat is one simple entity, one simple guf, הרי כשחיללו וביטלו מקצת השבת פגעו וביטלו את כולה, כי כשם שלא ניתן לחלק גוף חי לחלקים, כך לא ניתן לחלק שבת אחד לחלקים. ואם חלק ממנה חולל, קדושתה פרחה ואינה קיימת עוד בשבת, גם לא ברגעים הבאים אחריה. If we say that Shabbat is considered one single entity and one single goof, just like one cannot separate a live body into separate different pieces and separate different limbs, it's only one single entity, one single body. So too in regards to Shabbat, every moment, the fact, if Chav Shalom, somebody was meferet Kedushata, somebody that desecrated the Shabbat and brought Chaz v'Shalom Tuma into the Kedusha of Shabbat, that makes that the whole Shabbat was desecrated. Therefore, based on this approach, one doesn't have to keep Shabbat anymore. Because if once the Kedusha was desecrated, the holiness of Shabbat was desecrated, then that's it, the whole Shabbat is gone. One cannot go back. This is according to the approach that the 24 hours of Shabbat is like one single body, one single entity. But according to the other approach, if every single moment of Shabbat is not like limbs put together to create a body, but rather every single moment of Shabbat is an entity of its own. It's his own separate Kedusha, and it's not dependent on something else. It's not dependent on the moment before and not dependent on the moment after. It's its own Kedusha. And therefore, if somebody, Chaz v'Shalom, desecrated this moment of Shabbat, the next moment of Shabbat does not become desecrated because it's not dependent on the previous one. And the same goes for the time that he did keep Shabbat. Do we say no? Now that he didn't, that he desecrated Shabbat, the holiness of the holiness of Shabbat before was as no holiness to it? No. According to this approach, one is not dependent on the other, and therefore, if somebody did desecrate Shabbat for that one moment, he still has an obligation for the next moments to come, and the holiness of Shabbat is still here. This is, if we say that this is the basic approach, based on this approach. Another question is ger shenitgayer באמצע שבת, האם הוא חייב בשמירת שבת בשעות השבת הנותרות שבאותה שבת, או שאינו חייב בשמירת שבת זו אלא רק מהשבת הבא ואילך? And the same question applies not to just the desecration of Shabbat. It will be, for example, a goy that converted on Shabbat, even though on a side note, if we look up in the Shulchan Aruch Ilchos Gerut and Yoreh De'ah, one should not convert on Shabbat for different reasons, because you need a bed din, etc., etc. You can look up over there the reasons why we don't lechatchila be megayer somebody, we don't convert anybody on Shabbat. But let's say that this is the case where he did convert. He went to the Dvila, he went to the mikveh, and he did whatever he did. He's converted now. The question is now, if it's already in the middle of Shabbat, before that he didn't keep Shabbat. Not only he didn't keep Shabbat, he's not allowed to keep Shabbat, as we know, Go Shomer Shabbat, right? He was not allowed to keep Shabbat. Therefore, now that he's converted, does he have to keep Shabbat for the rest of the remaining hours or the remaining moments of Shabbat? Or do we say no? So this again will be, his question will be solved based on these two approaches. If Shabbat is own separate moment, every moment is not dependent on the other, therefore the fact that he desecrated now Shabbat doesn't obligate him he's not allowed to desecrate the remaining time of Shabbat, but rather he has to continue and keep Shabbat for the rest of the remaining moments or hours of Shabbat. Or based on the other approach, if Shabbat is one separate entity, the fact that he is desecrated a moment in Shabbat, he is not obligated anymore to keep Shabbat. Same interesting question that we find as Bnei Israel at Matan Torah. Matan Torah, Bnei Israel, as we know, Matan Torah was on Shabbat. So the commandment of keeping and preserving the holiness of Shabbat and not desecrating it was only given on Shabbat day, and they were not commanded from Friday night. So same question applies. Did Bnei Israel have to keep the Shabbat for the remaining moments or the remaining time, or do we say no? The fact that they desecrated, they were not commanded from Friday night, they're not commanded from Friday, and therefore they don't have to keep this Shabbat, and they could only start from the next Shabbat. And again, this question will be solved based on the two approaches, whether Shabbat is one separate entity or it's every moment is a different entity of itself. We find a similar question in regards to other halachot, in regards to, for example, Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, if somebody, for example, eats on Yom Kippur, for whatever reason it is, obviously we're not talking about a person that was allowed to eat on Yom Kippur and he was not allowed to fast. This is a separate question. We're talking about a person that he woke up in the morning, forgot it was Yom Kippur, and he ate something. Now, do we say the same thing? The same question applies. Yom Kippur, one of the mitzvot is that one should fast. V'inu et nafshotechem. Right? And therefore, the fact that a person ate does not mean he desecrated all of Yom Kippur. The whole holiness of Yom Kippur is desecrated, and therefore he doesn't have to fast anymore. Or do we say no? He still has an obligation to fast. And again, this same question will be solved based on the different approaches. Another question would be in regards to a Kohen or a Nazir. A Kohen or a Nazir are not allowed to render themselves impure by either touching a dead body or touching anything that could bring tumah to them. The Nazir or the Nazir or the Kohen is not allowed to render themselves impure. Touching any kind of way or any sort of tumah. So in regards to that, we have the same question. The fact that the Kohen now became impure, he's already impure. He touched a dead animal. He touched a nevela. He touched a dead body. Whatever, something that rendered him impure. Is he allowed to continue impuring himself? Is he allowed to render himself impure again? He's already impure. The same applies for the Nazir. Do we say again the same question, a similar question? Do we say that the fact that he's already impure, so he could continue to become impure, and it doesn't matter how much tumah, and the tumah cannot go even deeper? How much tumah can he get? He's impure. I said he's impure. Is there more tumah that the Kohen could get? Or is he allowed to get more tumah? Or the Nazir? So, the halacha l'maaseh, there's a great difference between both the cases. So in regards to Shabbat and Yom Kippur, we find in many places, it's brought down in the footnote over here in Yerushalmi and Masachet Eruvin, all the different cases, even in the case was not mentioned here in the actual Sikha, but in the foot case, Katan Sheigdil, a Katan, a young boy that grew up, he's 13 in the middle of Shabbat. Does he, for example, he has 2 hairs. Right before Shabbat, he didn't have that. On Shabbat, they discovered that he brought the signs, pubical hairs, which make him already an adult. So does he have an obligation from now on to keep Shabbat? Again, this applies to the same question. So the answer is simply that Shabbat and Yom Kippur are considered every moment of Shabbat and Yom Kippur are considered a separate entity of itself, and every moment has a separate kedusha. Therefore, somebody that desecrated Shabbat or ate on Yom Kippurim, for the remaining time, for the remaining hours or moments, he has to continue and keep Shabbat or keep on fasting, even though he already ate something. And therefore, in regards to a ger shenitgayer, answers a question. Ger shenitgayer, and it's Shabbat, he has to preserve the Shabbat for the remaining order, for the remaining time. Therefore, just like we find in the Mechilta, just like we find the Lashon in the Mechilta that says that since we already desecrated a part of Shabbat, let's desecrate the rest of it. but rather every moment of Shabbat one has to keep. This is said in regards to Yom Kippurim and Shabbat. And even though a moment of it was desecrated, whether by desecrating Shabbat, by doing a melacha, or desecrating Yom Kippurim by eating, one must continue to preserve the holiness of these days and not desecrating them anymore. Now, in regards to a Kohen, we find in the Ravad, the Ravad in Ilchot Nezirut and Para, Masechet Para, Mishnah Hei Alachat Tedvav, says as follows. I'm sorry, not in the Mishnah, but in the Rambam, Nezirut. Para Hei and Alachat Tedvav. So in regards to that, it is said, the Rabbit said, She'im nitmeu, and I quote, She'im nitmeu en alem od chiyuv tum'ah u'mutar lahem losif eleitama. If once the Kohen or the Nazir was rendered impure, they don't have a chiyuv tum'ah anymore. In other words, obviously a Kohen and a Nazir, once they become Tameh, whether it's Beshogik, they have to bring a sin offering, or whatever the case is, they have to bring a Korban to atone for their sins from rendering themselves impure. But if they touch again, they have to bring another Korban? No, they don't. Because, and there's not a Chiyuv of Tumah. The Chiyuv of the Tumah, of the impurity, will be set once, and therefore they are allowed to render themselves impure again. If, for example, they need to touch a dead body, if they're already impure, there's not a problem of continuing to add an impurity, because there's nothing, the impurity cannot go deeper or cannot go to a higher level of impurity. The fact that a person, the Kohen as the Nazir becomes impure, he is impure and there's nothing to add to it. But the question is, the Rebbe explains, what is the difference between these two halachot? What is the definition and the essence of every halacha that causes the differences between them? Between Shabbat, that even though it's been desecrated, one should continue preserving it, so too Yom Kippur. And the difference between Nazir and Kohen, once they become impure, they don't have this obligation of preventing themselves to add any impurity. So this differences is based on the simple explanation as that, does the mitzvah itself is on the gavra or on the chefza? Is the mitzvah itself on the person itself, or on the chefza, or on the day itself? In regards to the prohibitions of tuma, the impurity, this prohibition is in regards chalim ala adam. It's on the gavra, it's on the person himself. And therefore, once the person himself becomes impure, he has no longer anything to add to his impurity. Like we explained, the impurity cannot go deeper or higher to higher levels. He's impure, he's impure. And therefore, once he becomes impure, there's nothing to add to his impurity. And therefore, he doesn't have to watch himself from not becoming impure anymore, because we're not adding any other tumah. This is, and this doesn't apply. So let's go back to Shabbat and Yom Kippur. This does not apply to Shabbat and Yom Kippur, because Yom Kippur and Shabbat, the tumah itself, the kedusha itself is on the day. The holiness is on the day itself, is not on the person. And therefore, even though a person, Chaz v'Shalom, desecrated Shabbat or desecrated Yom Kippurim, that doesn't change anything in the fact that the day itself is still holy. It's not him. He desecrated Shabbat. He desecrated Yom Kippurim, Chaz v'Shalom. And therefore it doesn't change the fact of the holiness of Yom Shabbat. The holiness of Shabbat is still here. The holiness of Yom Kippur is still here. Fact is, other Jews are still celebrating that Shabbat, even though this one person desecrated it. It doesn't change the day of Shabbat and the holiness. And therefore, the holiness is still here, which obligates the person to continue and preserving Shabbat and not desecrating it.